Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his cluttered desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor, his eyes bloodshot from days of relentless code-breaking. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, each one a piece of a deadly puzzle. It was May 25, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance of encrypted messages. The Japanese naval codes had been partially cracked. But Admiral Chester Nimitz needed more than fragments. He needed certainty. Rochefort's team at Station HYPO had detected massive Japanese naval movements. With references to a mysterious target designated AF, intelligence suggested it was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. But doubt lingered like morning fog over Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor's devastation just 6 months earlier, was orchestrating something grand. His combined fleet had grown drunk on victory after victory. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island. The rising sun seemed unstoppable, its naval aviation the finest in the world. Yamamoto's plan was audacious in its scope: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it completely. From his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship, Yamamoto commanded a force that dwarfed anything America could muster. For fleet carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu formed the spearhead of his mobile force under Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor, their veteran pilots seasoned by months of combat. Across the Pacific, the Japanese plan relied on deception within deception. While Nagumo's carriers would strike Midway, drawing American forces northward, Yamamoto's main battle fleet would position itself to annihilate any American ships that responded. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would further confuse American intelligence. It was a masterpiece of naval strategy, or so it seemed, but Rochefort had a different kind of masterstroke in mind. If his suspicions about AF were correct, he could turn Japanese deception against itself.
How the plan?
Proposed to Nimitz was breathtakingly simple. Make the Japanese confirm their own target. On May 27th, Midway's garrison received orders to transmit an uncoded message reporting a water shortage in their distillation plant. Within 24 hours, Japanese radio intercepts reported that AF was experiencing water supply problems. Nimitz now knew with certainty that Yamamoto was coming to Midway. But knowing and surviving were two different things. The Japanese armada approaching consisted of over 160 ships, including 8 carriers, 11 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft. Against this juggernaut, Nimitz could muster 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, along with whatever aircraft could operate from Midway itself. The odds were staggering. But Rochefort's intelligence coup had given America something more valuable than ships or planes: knowledge. While Yamamoto's admirals believed they were approaching an unsuspecting enemy, American forces were already positioning themselves for history's most decisive naval ambush. As the sun set over the Pacific on June 3, 1942, both fleets moved inexorably toward their destiny. The Japanese sailed with supreme confidence, their admirals certain that American naval power would soon rest on the Pacific floor. They had no inkling that their own coded messages had become the instrument of their undoing. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of Carrier Akagi as his mobile force cut through Pacific swells toward Midway. The veteran of Pearl Harbor commanded Japan's most elite naval aviation units, their Zero fighters and dive bombers having swept Allied forces from the skies across half the Pacific. Dawn of June 4, 1942. Promised to add another glorious chapter to the Imperial Navy's string of victories. At 0 for 30 hours, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway 108 aircraft, rising from the decks of his 4 carriers like a swarm of deadly hornets. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation through the pre-dawn darkness. His bombers and fighters aimed at crushing Midway's defenses. The plan was methodical: neutralize the American base and prepare for the inevitable American naval response, but unknown to Nagumo. Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Enterprise had positioned Task Force 16 exactly where Rochefort's intelligence predicted the Japanese would appear. At 0534 hours, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed, spotted the Japanese fleet. His radio crackled across the Pacific. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 3-0. Distance 150 miles. The trap was set, but its success depended on split-second timing and incredible courage. On Midway, Marine fighters scrambled to intercept Tominaga's incoming strike. Captain Marion Carl and Major Floyd Parks led 26 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats against the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The Americans fought with desperate valor, but their aircraft were outclassed. Zero fighters tore through the Marine formations like wolves among sheep. 15 American fighters fell in flames, but their sacrifice bought precious time. Tominaga's bombers struck Midway with devastating precision. Hangars erupted in flame, fuel dumps exploded, and the runway cratered under falling bombs. Yet as smoke cleared, Tominaga realized the damage wasn't complete. His radio message to Nagumo was understated but crucial. There is need for a second attack. This single transmission would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. Standing doctrine demanded he prepare for American naval forces, keeping half his aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship targets. But Tominaga's request meant rearming those planes with land attack ordnance for another strike on Midway. The admiral chose what seemed logical: finish destroying the base before dealing with any American ships. As Japanese mechanics frantically rearmed aircraft below decks, American dive bombers were already winging toward their targets. Colonel Walter Sweeney led 16 Army Air Force's B-17 flying fortresses in a high-altitude attack on the Japanese fleet. Their bombs fell harmlessly around the maneuvering carriers, but the attack confirmed what Nagumo feared: American forces were closer than expected. At 0705 hours, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted American ships to the northeast. The pilot's report sent shockwaves through Akagi's bridge. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees. Distance 240 miles. Minutes later came an even more ominous update. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College's analysis, Kumo's response revealed the fatal flaw in Japanese tactical thinking. He ordered his aircraft rearmed, yet again this time back to anti-ship configuration. Below decks, aviation ordnance crews worked frantically amid stacks of bombs and torpedoes, turning the carrier hangar decks into floating ammunition dumps. Dance of Giants was reaching its climax, with both fleets maneuvering for the decisive blow. But while American admirals knew exactly where their enemies were, Japanese commanders remained blind to the trap closing around them. Yamamoto's masterstroke of deception had become America's greatest advantage. At 0806 hours on June 4th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 off the deck of USS Hornet into what would become naval aviation's most heroic sacrifice. 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete before the war began, flew directly toward the most powerful carrier force in the world. Waldron knew it was suicide, but he also understood that desperate courage might crack open the battle for the dive bombers following behind. From his position on Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance watched the morning unfold with calculated precision. The 55-year-old cruiser admiral had replaced the hospitalized William Bull Halsey just days before the battle, inheriting command of Task Force 16 with barely time to learn his pilots' names. Yet Spruance possessed something more valuable than carrier experience: an analytical mind that could see patterns in chaos. Nagumo's predicament was becoming desperate. His returning Midway strike force circled overhead, desperately low on fuel, while below decks, his mechanics struggled to rearm the second wave for ship attack. The Japanese admiral faced an impossible choice: land his returning aircraft and be vulnerable during refueling, or leave them circling until they crashed into the sea. At 0920 hours, Waldron's Torpedo Squadron found the Japanese fleet. 0 fighters fell on the lumbering devastators like hawks on field mice. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 American torpedo bombers were blazing wrecks scattered across the Pacific. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket while watching the battle unfold around him. The slaughter continued as torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 12 of 13 planes. 30 minutes, American torpedo aviation in the Pacific had been virtually annihilated. But their sacrifice achieved something beyond their wildest dreams. Every Zero fighter in the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had descended to wave-top level to massacre the torpedo bombers. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 0:10, 22 hours, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bombers out of the morning sun. His Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft had been airborne for over 2 hours, their fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels. McCluskey had overflown the expected Japanese position and found empty ocean. But his decision to search northwest along the Japanese destroyer screen had led him to the greatest target in naval history, for Japanese fleet carriers steamed in, a perfect box formation below, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs, torpedoes, and aviation gasoline covered every carrier's hangar deck. The Japanese fleet had become a floating arsenal waiting for a spark. McCluskey rolled into his attack dive with 37 Dauntless bombers behind him. At that same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 more dive bombers from Yorktown in a coordinated attack from the southeast. The timing was coincidental, but perfect. 64 American dive bombers plunging out of the sun toward targets that couldn't have been more vulnerable. The first bomb struck Akagi at 0:10:26 hours, exploding among aircraft spotted on the flight deck. Secondary explosions began immediately as aviation gasoline and ordnance detonated in chain reactions. Within minutes, Japan's premier aircraft carrier was a floating inferno. Her flight deck buckled and torn, her hangar spaces filled with deadliest smoke. Carrier Kaga suffered even worse damage as multiple bombs found their mark. Her wooden flight deck became a furnace that burned with the intensity of a blast furnace. Soryu took 3 direct hits that turned her into a floating crematorium within 20 minutes. According to the definitive account from Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese fleet that had seemed invincible at dawn was transformed into a collection of burning hulks by noon. In the space of 6 minutes, American dive bombers had achieved what seemed impossible. They had broken the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. But the battle was far from over. And Admiral Yamamoto still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the world, as black smoke billowed from 3 burning carriers. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu, prepared to strike back with the fury of a wounded dragon, the only Japanese flat top to escape the morning's devastation. Hiryu immediately launched every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack. At 11:30 hours, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet. Guided by the smoke from burning Japanese ships, Admiral Spruance faced his own crisis aboard Enterprise. His air groups had scattered across the Pacific in their attacks, leaving his task force vulnerable just as Japanese reconnaissance planes located his position. The calculated risk of the morning's assault was about to be tested by Japanese vengeance. USS Yorktown, under Captain Elliot Buckmaster's command, bore the brunt of Hiryu's fury. The carrier had survived Coral Sea just a month earlier, her battle damage hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor in an incredible 72-hour effort. Now she faced her final trial. At 12:10 hours, Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through American fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a web of steel and flame. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among parked aircraft. The second bomb destroyed her uptakes, reducing her speed to barely 6 knots. The third hit ruptured her aviation gasoline system, creating a fire hazard that forced the evacuation of several compartments. But American damage Control was superior to anything the Japanese had imagined. Within an hour, Yorktown's crew had the fires under control and her boilers back online. By 1340 hours, she was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft. To Japanese observers, she appeared to be a different carrier entirely, a resurrection that would have profound consequences. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led Hiryu's second strike toward what he believed were 2 American carriers. The same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway now flew with a fuel tank damaged by American fighters, knowing he would never return to his ship. His 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters represented the last offensive punch of the once mighty Japanese mobile force. Tominaga's attack achieved what seemed impossible. 2 torpedo hits on Yorktown's port side. The explosions knocked out her electrical power and jammed her rudder, leaving her dead in the water. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship at 3 p.m., believing his vessel was doomed. From a distance, Japanese pilots reported sinking 2 American carriers, giving Admiral Yamaguchi hope that the battle might still be salvaged. The illusion shattered at 5 p.m. when 24 dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, found Hiryu steaming alone. Across the darkening Pacific, the last Japanese carrier died as her sisters had under a rain of American bombs that turned her flight deck into a furnace and her hangar into a tomb by sunset on June 4th. 1942, Japanese naval aviation had suffered its death blow. For fleet carriers, the backbone of their Pacific offensive lay burning or sunk. More critically, the irreplaceable veteran aircrews who had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months were gone forever. Over 300 of Japan's finest pilots, an aircrew lost in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, still approaching Midway with his massive surface fleet, received the devastating reports aboard his flagship Yamato. The architect of Pearl Harbor found himself commanding the most powerful battleship force in history. But without air cover in an age when aircraft ruled the seas, his response revealed the strategic genius that had made him Japan's greatest. Naval Commander, at 9:15 p.m. He ordered a general retreat. The sword that had hung over American forces since Pearl Harbor had been shattered at Midway, but at tremendous cost. American losses included 1 carrier, a destroyer, and 147 aircraft. Yet these were losses America could replace. Japan's casualties for carriers, a cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including irreplaceable veteran aircrews, represented damage from which the Imperial Navy would never recover in the pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942. Captain William Brockman peered through the periscope of USS Nautilus at a scene from Dante's Inferno. The American submarine had been stalking Japanese forces since the battle's opening hours. And now fortune had delivered an incredible target, the abandoned hulk of carrier Soryu, still burning and listing heavily to starboard at 060. 9 hours, Brockman fired 3 torpedoes at the dying carrier. The explosions that followed sent Soryu to her final rest, taking with her the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and a dozen other conquered territories. For the submarine crew watching through their periscope, it was a moment of savage satisfaction. The hunters had become the hunted. Admiral Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. His combined fleet still possessed overwhelming surface superiority, including the massive battleships Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato. But without air cover, these steel leviathans were as vulnerable as the dinosaurs they resembled. The lessons of Prince of Wales and Repulse, sunk by Japanese aircraft just 6 months earlier, were not lost on the man who had planned those very attacks. Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe's cruiser and destroyer force presented Yamamoto with one last opportunity for salvaging something from the disaster. The 4 heavy cruisers Kumano, Suzuya, Makuma, Mogami had been ordered to bombard Midway during the night of June 4th, but the order came too late. Now, they raced northwest, trying to escape American air power that would surely come with dawn. Captain Richard Fleming of Marine Fighting Squadron 241 had other ideas. At 0805 hours on June 5th, Fleming, led a formation of marine dive bombers in pursuit of the fleeing Japanese cruisers. His Douglas SBD Dauntless had already survived 3 days of desperate combat. But Fleming pressed his attack with the same fury that had characterized the entire battle. Mogami and Mikuma paid the price for their retreat. Fleming's bombs struck both cruisers, starting fires and flooding that reduced their speed to barely 10 knots. The damaged warships became sitting targets for follow-up attacks throughout the morning. By noon, Mikuma was listing so heavily her crew began abandoning ship, while Mogami limped away with her stern nearly blown off. The Japanese submarine I-168, under Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, provided a final twist to the battle's narrative. At dawn on June 6th, Tanabe's submarine found USS Yorktown under tow by minesweeper Vireo, her damage control parties working frantically to save the wounded carrier. A spread of 4 torpedoes finished what Japanese bombs had begun Yorktown and destroyer Hamon. Alongside providing assistance, both went to the bottom within hours. But even this tactical victory couldn't mask the strategic catastrophe that had befallen Japan. According to intelligence reports later analyzed by the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Midway disaster represented more than the loss of ships and planes. It marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific War. The human cost was staggering. Carrier Akagi took her crew of over 1,500 men to the bottom, including some of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. Kaga's loss eliminated another 1,600 sailors and airmen. Soryu and Hiryu each carried over 700 skilled personnel to their graves. These weren't merely numbers. They represented years of training and combat experience that Japan couldn't replace. Admiral Nagumo, rescued from burning Akagi by destroyer Nowaki, would never again command a carrier force. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor found himself aboard a hospital ship. His military career effectively ended by the miscalculations at Midway. His fate symbolized that of the entire Japanese mobile force, once invincible, now broken beyond repair. As American search planes combed the Pacific for survivors and stragglers, the full scope of their victory became clear. In 4 days of combat, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Japan's admirals had indeed found no answer to Midway's masterstroke of deception, and that failure would echo through every subsequent battle until the war's end. Emperor Hirohito received the news of Midway's disaster in the hushed confines of his palace study, where cherry blossoms outside the windows seemed to mock the reports of burning carriers and dead heroes. The man revered as a living god by 100 million Japanese subjects learned that his supposedly invincible navy had suffered its first major defeat since the Battle of Tsushima 37 years earlier. Imperial Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada faced the impossible task of explaining to the emperor how 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air crews had vanished in a single morning. The official reports, sanitized for imperial consumption, could not disguise the magnitude of the catastrophe. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been shattered, and with it, any hope of forcing America into a negotiated peace in Tokyo's Kasumi-Gaseki district. The Naval General Staff struggled to comprehend intelligence reports that seemed almost impossible to believe. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's trusted staff officer, had warned of exactly this scenario, that American code-breaking might turn Japanese deception against itself. Now those prophecies had materialized in the most devastating fashion imaginable. The psychological impact on Japanese naval commanders was perhaps more damaging than the material losses. Admiral Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, was quietly reassigned to shore duties. His reputation never recovered from the tactical disasters that had turned victory into catastrophe within 6 minutes of American dive bomber attacks. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay in ruins beneath the Pacific swells, but Admiral Yamamoto understood the strategic implications better than anyone in Tokyo. From his cabin aboard flagship Yamato, he composed a letter to Navy Minister Shimada that would prove prophetic. The combined fleet has suffered its most serious defeat since Tsushima. We have lost the initiative in the Pacific and will not regain it. The architect of Pearl Harbor had become the chronicler of his own strategy's failure. American intelligence. Intercepts revealed the full scope of Japanese desperation in the weeks following Midway. Frantic requests for replacement pilots flooded Tokyo from Pacific bases. But Japan's pilot training program could not produce aviators with the skill and experience lost at Midway. The Empire of the Rising Sun had traded quality for quantity, and the exchange rate was bankrupting their war effort. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Pacific. Hitler's Germany, counting on Japanese success to tie down American forces, found itself facing the full weight of American industrial might turned eastward. The Doolittle raid had embarrassed Japan. Midway had crippled it. The two-front war that American strategists had feared became instead a coordinated offensive that would stretch Axis forces beyond their breaking point. On June 10, 1842, Admiral Nimitz stood on the dock at Pearl Harbor as Enterprise, and Hornet returned from their triumph. The same harbor that had burned 6 months earlier now welcomed the victors of America's greatest naval battle. The contrast was not lost on the Pacific Fleet commander, who understood that Midway represented more than tactical victory. It marked the turning point of the Pacific War. According to post-war interviews conducted by naval historians, Japanese survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that never healed. The invincibility complex that had driven their early victories was replaced by a defensive mindset that would characterize Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. They had learned too late that superior technology and tactics could not overcome superior intelligence and preparation. The final irony belonged to Admiral Yamamoto himself. The man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had been undone by his own devotion to deception. His complex battle plan, with its multiple feints and diversions, has been dissected by American codebreakers and turned into the instrument of his fleet's destruction. The hunter's trap had become his own snare. 3 years after Midway's guns fell silent, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood in Tokyo Bay aboard USS Missouri, watching Japanese officials sign the surrender documents that would end World War II. The quiet, analytical officer who had replaced Bull Halsey at the battle's crucial moment reflected on how intelligence had proven more valuable than battleships in determining the Pacific War's outcome. The final accounting of Midway's aftermath revealed the true scope of American triumph. Japan lost not merely for carriers and their aircraft, but the irreplaceable core of veteran pilots who had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. These men, graduates of rigorous peacetime training programs, represented a decade of investment in naval aviation excellence that could never be recovered under wartime conditions. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the unsung hero whose code-breaking had made victory possible, found himself quietly transferred from his basement headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The intelligence officer who had delivered Japan's battle plans to American commanders discovered that success in warfare sometimes breeds as much jealousy as admiration. His masterstroke of deception remained classified for decades, denying him the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. The strategic consequences of Midway echoed through every subsequent Pacific battle. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces lacked the carrier aviation that might have turned the campaign in their favor. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots faced Japanese aviators with barely 6 months training compared to the veterans they had destroyed at Midway. The qualitative decline in Japanese naval aviation became a death spiral from which they never recovered. Emperor Hirohito's personal diary, discovered after the war, revealed the psychological impact of Midway's disaster on Japan's highest leadership. The emperor wrote of sleepless nights following the battle, understanding intuitively that his empire's offensive phase had ended forever. The divine wind that had supposedly protected Japan for centuries had been reversed by American intelligence and courage. Admiral Yamamoto's prophetic understanding of Midway's implications proved tragically accurate. Exactly 11 months after the battle, American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville, guided by the same cryptographic intelligence that had doomed his carriers. The architect of Pearl Harbor died as he had lived, the victim of superior American intelligence gathering and analysis. The human stories emerging from Midway's aftermath provided the most poignant testimony to the battle's significance. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific before rescue. His first-hand account of watching Japanese carriers burn became one of the war's most powerful testimonials to American sacrifice and determination. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack but missed Midway due to appendicitis, later wrote that his absence from the battle probably saved his life. The irony was profound. The man who had delivered Japan's greatest triumph was spared from witnessing its greatest defeat. His post-war conversion to Christianity reflected the spiritual crisis that Midway's disaster created among Japanese military leaders. According to declassified documents from the National Security Agency, American code-breaking capabilities extended far beyond the famous AF deception. The comprehensive penetration of Japanese naval codes provided American commanders with an intelligence advantage that persisted throughout the Pacific War. Midway became the template for intelligence-driven warfare that would characterize American military operations for the remainder of the 20th century. The final lesson of Midway transcended military tactics or strategic planning. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, information had become as important as ammunition. The admirals who commanded fleets and the pilots who flew missions remained crucial. But the anonymous codebreakers, working in basement offices, often determined battle outcomes before the first shot was fired, as the sun set over Pearl Harbor. On the battle's 3rd anniversary, Admiral Nimitz dedicated a memorial to the men who had died at Midway. His words captured the battle's enduring significance. They had no way of knowing that their sacrifice would change the course of history. But because they gave their lives with such courage, millions of others would live in freedom. The masterstroke of deception had become a foundation stone of victory. Built upon the graves of heroes who had answered their nation's call in its darkest hour,